Ladies and gentlemen, our first keynote speaker of the day is the Managing Director of ANZ Modern Engineering Practice at Accenture Australia and looks after the global DevOps practice as well as the Agile practice of Accenture in Asia Pacific. He comes with more than 12 years of experience on accelerating software delivery through innovative approaches like Agile and DevOps. He supports major public and private sector companies in Australia and overseas in their search for efficient IT delivery. He shares his skilled experiences at international conferences and is a regular blogger at notafactoryanymore.com. He's also the author of the award-winning DevOps for the Modern Enterprise, a book that provides pragmatic guidance to help companies adopt DevOps and Agile in an enterprise context. And today, he'll be sharing his expert opinion on implementing DevSecOps and will be providing tips and tricks on how to approach it. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my utmost privilege to now invite on your screens the one and only Mr. Mirco Herin.
Welcome, everyone, to my talk today about DevSecOps at scale. So very quickly, my name is Mirco Herin. I will talk to you about my experience with really bringing DevSecOps to organizations that work in very complex environments and what that means and what you need to consider as you do this. It's a bit of a shame that I can't be in person in India. They have to rely on video this time around, but I know all the work that has gone into this event to make the virtual experience as good as possible. So hopefully you guys enjoy the event and get a lot out of it. I know a lot of the speakers are fantastic. So let's jump into the content, shall we? So DevSecOps is a pretty broad topic, and many of you would have seen diagrams like this, where show the different silos and barriers between different functions. Right? So traditional, obviously, with DevOps, we had the one between Dev and Ops, but if you extend the spectrum out, we go all the way to the business, and between business and IT, it's really the agile movement that has tried to eradicate that barrier. And what we're now talking about with DevSecOps is really zoning in on the security aspect. And we will come back again and again in this talk to the challenge that we've seen with security sitting outside of everything. Right? So they're doing audits, but they're really coming in, getting invited in for a very specific activity. And if you do that, you're basically relying on catching something specific at an event versus embedding it in everything you do. And just as everything else we do in DevOps, DevSecOps is trying to embed the security component in everything we do. And that is especially important because these days, security has a completely different challenge to address. And I'll only give you a couple of examples. If you think about DevOps in its core idea that we are building lots and lots of software in very, very automated pipelines. That means what we used to do once a month, once a quarter, we are now doing every day and potentially multiple times a day, perhaps multiple times an hour. But that means we are consuming at a very different rate things from other places, software libraries, the frameworks, components from packaged software. So that means every time we are consuming something, we are potentially exposing a risk. So if we would then say we are only checking that at the very end or at a specific point in time, then we are way too late. Yeah, so the idea here is, like we did with everything else in DevOps, we're trying to bring this into the lifecycle as often as possible. And the old principle that we're using in DevOps applies here as well. We prefer speed over accuracy. And what I mean by that is there are certain things that you can only do when everything is frozen. Right? And that is where if you run exactly what is in production with exactly the same workloads, that's when you get perfect information. But if we wait for that, it is way too late. We rather have 80%, 90% accuracy very early in the cycle when it's just running on a developer machine than waiting until the very end. All right. So why am I talking about this, and what do I want to bring to this conversation? I really work in extremely complicated environments. Right? So for me, you're not going to get kind of the super out there modern approaches, because I work with banks, I work with insurances, I work with governments. And that means for me, DevSecOps always has an aspect of working with a lot of old technologies, a lot of exposure to old middleware versions, old databases, software products like packaged software that is incredibly hard to update because they might only be supported on certain versions of underlying libraries or underlying operating systems that actually have their own vulnerability. Yeah, so for me, it's usually not the case that I can get to a clean slate. So you get that through the presentation. I do blog quite a bit about what I learned, and I also have a book on DevOps where you can get some of the experiences in writing. So before we get now too deep into these specifics, I want to catch us all up what the overall challenges are that we are up against, right? And when I started working in IT, there was this concept of transformation, right? The same way that we are now talking about Agile and DevOps and DevSecOps transformations. And back then, it seemed to be a pretty simple concept, right? So when I started, someone said it to me, here's what we do. We've identified a future state, right? We know our current state, and then we do a transformation. It's basically just bridging the gap, right? If we are at a specific point, we want to get somewhere else, then we just have to navigate that gap. And I think that worked for a while for us because the future state was stable enough. The current state was something that was reasonably well documented. And the transformation itself was something that we could get our head around, like implementing a new CRM system, implementing a new ERP system, those kind of things. The challenge that we are now up against is that this future state keeps evolving, right? So if you discuss what is state of play in DevOps right now, it is very different to what it was 12 months ago, 24 months ago, etc. So if any of these transformations in a large organization, they do take multiple years, in that time, the future state has moved on. So even if we had a perfect plan that brings us up to the state that we've currently defined as future state, we will fall short by the time we actually get there. Yeah. So that's a really significant difference of how we need to approach this. We can't just come up with a future state that we try to achieve. There are other elements that we also need to challenge. So, for example, do we actually know our as is? And I always use this super old example. This is from a book in 1991, which talks about really quality in software management. And what they have in there is research that explains a lot about the challenges that I used to see, which is they went to an organization and they said, here are 100 best practices for organizations like you. How many do you actually use in your organization? And when they went to the VP, they got 67% of that. They said they use 67 of the 100. And they went to the directors, they got 58. They went to the managers and it dropped to roughly over 30. And then they went to the engineers, the people actually using these practices, and they get just about 12%. And then that used to be really confusing to me. Why on earth do organizations don't know what they're doing? And the thing is, organizations are incredibly complex. Very simple example, continuous integration. Ask someone, do you guys use continuous integration in your organization? They would say, yeah, of course we do. Right? And then if you get to the engineer at the bottom and you ask them, hey, what do you do on continuous integration? They say, well, look, we have a couple of feature branches. On one of these feature branches, we are on Jenkins that actually does proper continuous integration. But then we need to integrate multiple branches. We need to integrate with some other products. And that's really something that we do in a normal way. So you kind of use continuous integration, but not really. But at the VP level, you would never understand the nuances of this, right? So we don't really fully grasp the complexity and where the challenges are, because very often the challenge is not because you don't have Jenkins. The challenges are that you're not actually integrating your solution end to end early enough to find problems. That was in the 1990s. Yeah? So then by now, we should be much better, we think. But here's from 2018, State of DevOps report, where they looked for 15 criteria around how well DevOps is adopted. And you can see similar, right? C-suite, 58%, engineers, 37%. Now, DevOps is quite broad, but we can make it a lot more concrete. Cloud. Who's using the cloud? Well, in the Accelerate State of DevOps report, 67% say they use the cloud. If you then ask them, are you using it according to the core definition from the National Institute of Standards? That falls down to 22%. Right? So when we say we have this transformation, we have this evolving end state, Now we also have a problem that we actually don't know where we are, because depending on who you ask in the organization, they have a different perspective of where they currently are positioned. So then it becomes impossible to actually make the change from A to B if B keeps moving and A is something that we don't fully understand. And then there's also this kind of conceptual thing that I think we need to get our head around. For the longest time, we had these transformation cycles that looked like this, right? We had a problem, a business problem, and a security incident, right? And said, okay, now we need to get rid of all the security vulnerabilities, and we run a big program, right? Our end state is a stable state. Once we are clean, everything will remain clean and beautiful. We invest a lot of money, and then at the end of the program, we start realizing that was painful. That took us a lot of time. So how can we now get ourselves back in control in regards to cost, etc.? And so what you tend to see is these cycles. You see a cycle of cost reduction until the problem becomes big enough. We accrue technical debt, and then an event happens. Right? It might be leadership change, might be security incident, might be new technology, and then we do the same thing again. These cycles used to take 3 to 5 years when we talk about, an ERP implementation, CRM implementation, to move from client server to central to internet to whatever, right? And that was okay because technology wasn't evolving fast enough. The competition wasn't evolving fast enough. That the 3 to 5 year cycle were survivable. But nowadays, 3 to 5 years is enormous. Like digital competitors come in and completely disrupt your business model in that time. So you really need to think differently about transformation work. Yeah. And what we really want to get to is this kind of ongoing, evolving organization. But that's a really painful transformation for organizations because it's not like we can do DevSecOps and be done with it. Right? It means we need to continue to get better at it. It's similar to when you go to the doctor and you have high blood pressure and you're slightly overweight, and when you go to the doctor, what you really want is them to give you a pill that you take and your problems go away. All right. And what the doctor says is like, look, Mirco, what you need to do is you need to change your lifestyle. You need to eat healthier. You need to work out more. And that way you will get this under control. And you don't have to do this for a day, a month, a year. You have to do this for the rest of your life. That's not the message I wanted. That's not what I pay the doctor for. Right? I wanted him to just give me an answer that is very and I can get done with. And what he says is I have to completely differently behavior going forward. Right? And that's what we're asking organizations now. We're not asking them to do an implementation. We're not asking them to do a transformation. We're asking them to change the way that they behave, that they continue to evolve and learn. And that's a much trickier proposition. But now you can see how difficult this context is in which we are trying to address the security concerns of DevSecOps. Because we are against different threats, we are in this context where transformations are not something that have a concrete finish line. So how can we start addressing this? I'll explore a couple of these concepts to get you a bit closer to that. So first of all, I wanted to highlight that for me, there's 3 dimensions of DevSecOps that are important. The first one, and a lot of people talk about that, is the application and code, and that includes all the libraries. So that is, the struts example. Yeah. That's important, right? What are we using? We're using more and more open source. We're doing more and more custom development again. Like we had this period where we started to do more packaged software. Now we're back to more custom software. And that means we're consuming these things and we're consuming them more frequently. Yeah. And the risk, I used to have this conversation with someone, said, okay, well, we have this challenge that we keep using old versions of libraries. And so we've hard-coded somewhere that we're using 2.4 and we continue using 2.4 even when 2.8, 3.0, whatever has come out. And that was their main concern, right? And I think that's valid because a lot of organizations don't know what versions of libraries they have floating around and what security exposure they have for that. And so that's a concern. But there's a new concern that has come up as well, because if you change that paradigm and said, we always take latest, so always take current, because that's where all the security vulnerabilities are removed from. Well, that is true. But what if someone is actually now hacking into that and built a backdoor or anything else, any vulnerability into a repository and the latest version, and through that infects a whole bunch of organizations? Yeah. So you now need to start figuring out, how do I protect myself against that? How do I understand that? Because what we've seen now is, if someone had a good reputation on Git and they disappear and they say, I don't want to do that anymore, they kind of stop using their account. Someone else jumps in, takes that, they say it's still the old reputation, and publishes as part of this new this login, and hence makes it very easy for people to trust them, even though they're producing malware ultimately. Right. And so, or you have people who are sitting in the middle and trying to get themselves through a man-in-the-middle attack, where they then start injecting things in the middle. Yeah. So you have this threat now that is not happening at a specific time. That happens hundreds and hundreds of times a day as developer continuously building continuous delivery pipelines. Yeah. So if we don't control that software supply chain, we are at risk. But that's the risk that I think people understand reasonably well. On the right-hand side, we have environments and infrastructure, right? And that is a typical example of someone having, certain ports open. That's the people who have their AWS accounts in a public Git library, a Git repository, and people use that and start mining Bitcoin. Fine. Right? These are the kind of, how do we make sure that our infrastructure is protected? There's another aspect now that has certainly come up, and that is the actual pipeline of tools that we're using. Because think about this. If you are deploying hundreds of times a day into production, the system that you use for that is a production-like system. Because if that thing goes down for whatever reason, you're very unlikely to be able to deploy the same frequency again. Like I was working for a client where their Jenkins instance got deleted by mistake, right? And they had no organizational knowledge anymore on how to manually deploy something, right? So they had to kind of figure out where all these different pieces of code were and recreate the Jenkins pipeline. But they were out for quite a while. Yeah? And that obviously causes a risk. You can think about another threat here where people get the key to the tooling and through that can inject anything into this pipeline, including any kind of malware, and it makes its way through to production if we haven't hardened that pipeline well enough. Right? So we need to protect our tools now as well as our code and the infrastructure. And that to me are the three core dimensions of DevSecOps that we need to think about. We can take this little bit broader, right? And you can think about a complete security framework. And then what you add on top of that, in the middle, you see the software and application security and infrastructure security that I spoke about. But then obviously things like identity and access management play a role, right? And I just think about some of the stuff that I've experienced, right? Where I'm a consultant, right? So I sometimes come back to the same client months later, and my account is still valid from before. And it still has the same rights that I had back then, the same access to the same systems. People move between roles and keep their old access. So as you move enough roles around, you become a super user because you have all these different accesses. And if then I'm the disgruntled employee, I have access to everything and can take whatever I want to take it back out of the organization. Right? So we need to also think about those things and automate those processes as well as the core software process that I spoke about before. And then obviously we have the cyber threat detection and response as well. I mean, I think that's more commonly associated with security. And then we have this other aspect here on the top around data security as well, which we know about the different concerns in cloud, etc. Where do we store data? What is actually where? I'm working a lot with financial services, where part of the CD pipeline is what data can we get from production and how can we mask it so that by pushing it into the continuous delivery environments, we are not actually getting access to production data and have identifiable information about any individuals. Yeah. Then think about this more in a lifecycle perspective. There are different things that you do at different parts of your delivery lifecycle. Right? So in the kind of traditional analyze or discover phase, where you really try to understand what business problem you're solving, you really try to understand what is the security profile. Are we talking about externally exposed systems, internally exposed systems, just IT support systems that are working in the back of house? And that makes a difference. That makes a difference on how serious we take even security vulnerabilities. Right? If you have a very exposed front-end system, you might have in your CD pipeline a rule that says we don't let any vulnerabilities through. But if it's a back of house system that is not really exposed, then you might say, okay, we will let this go for a week, a month, perhaps a couple of releases, but then we have to have it fixed. Right? So we give us more leeway because the faster you need to react, the more expensive that potentially can be, depending on how involved the fix is. Yeah, so you really need to think about the scoping of the security threat. In design, you do a lot more detailed threat modeling, like what are the actual exposures on all these components that I've highlighted before. And then we get into the more traditional CI/CD. Right? So, of course, in the CI cycle, we do static testing, and that means we do static code analysis of everything that goes into that. That might also include any of the libraries that we are consuming at that point in time. Yeah, so the composition analysis. Then we get into dynamic testing, and in dynamic testing, we obviously want to see whether the system itself behaves the right way. Yeah, and that is can well be done as part of a CD cycle. Very often, we see this being done in a parallel environment, right? So we are running those kind of tests, not necessarily in the integrated test environment. We're running it in a parallel environment so that our testing activities are not getting impacted by it. And once we've getting close to deployment or in deployment, depending on where your barrier for that sits, you do penetration testing. And no matter what we do in security, and actually the same is true for normal testing, there's, in my view, always an aspect of human testing, because the creativity of the human is just much broader. Right? They shouldn't do the mundane stuff that you can automate. But there's just this little bit of extra creativity that humans bring to this process that allows us to do, red versus blue team kind of attacks and all kinds of fun stuff that really exposes things that are incredibly relevant and useful for you to understand what problems you need to address. And then you get into operate. And then operate, I'm a huge fan of operate. Right? I mean, most people kind of see DevOps as the kind of the development cycle and not so much the what do we actually run in production. But for me, that's where a lot of learning is. Like, what do we actually see exposure? Where do we see attempted attacks? Right? How can we play this game of continuously evolving our systems so that we're getting better suited for the threats that are coming in? Yeah, and that brings the whole life cycle together. And you need to think about the technologies, right? The tools, of course, but even more importantly, the people and the processes, because the more they are involved, the more they are the people that make the difference. Yeah, and so you really need to think about it holistically. You can think about this, and this is just a different view of it in a little bit more detail, because it shows you the kind of the continuous, right? The continuous integration, continuous security, continuous deployment, continuous monitoring, and they all have to come together. We see different aspects that you play at different parts of this pipeline. Yeah, there is certainly an aspect here on how you embed better security in across the fabric, so that it's not just a phased activity, but that you are really doing this end to end, and you bring it all the way back to the next design and to the next threat modeling upfront for a new project or a new initiative. Purely technical, this is how that could look like from a CI perspective. Right, we have the developer that has an IDE plugin, and that IDE plugin might well already do some static code analysis to show you deprecated functions, coding standards, vulnerable code components, et cetera, et cetera. As you then go into Jenkins runs your state security tests. It executes the dynamic security test once you've deployed it somewhere, and you can also do some of the web interface components. I think the other thing that we not often talk about is that this stuff creates a backlog. Right? Here it's called a vulnerability repo. But the idea really is we're not going to solve everything, especially if you start on a brownfield. So we need to create this backlog of stuff that has obviously a severity of how bad the problem is, but then also what's the risk exposure. Remember the difference between front-end and back-end systems, the number of users that actually have access to these systems, et cetera, et cetera. So you want to create a prioritized backlog that you can then start working on, right? So you get the tickets created, you create the reporting and metrics against this, and you have this governance framework on top that allows you to fine-tune this, right? Because things change, your architecture changes. So you want to make sure that this continues to evolve and it's not a static process. So how do we then do all that, bring this all together in a little bit of a high-level roadmap, I guess? This is what I usually do. So first off, you do want to have a very, very short and high-level diagnostics so that you understand what are the actual challenges that you're up against, right? There's nothing worse than just adopting a framework and just plunging it on top of every organization. Like for me, when people ask me how long does it take, it's completely contextual. Like, what is the biggest problems you're trying to solve? That's what you're going to solve first, right? Of course, these frameworks all look similar, but the way that you focus makes a huge difference for the success of it. Actually, you want to understand what's your biggest problem. Is there a lot of old hardware sitting around, old middleware on top of that we perhaps should address first, right? Or move these applications into the cloud, into an evergreening environment, so I don't have to worry about that stuff anymore. And then I start worrying about the application component. Or perhaps it's the infrastructure that is completely unsecured, or with significant gaps in their security profile. Then we build the platform. With that information, it influences us what component we prioritize in that platform, right? And then we roll out and learn, right? We iteratively roll this stuff out, learn from it, change the platform, change the governance framework, and then we roll out further and further and further into the organization, right? And this never ends, because once we've rolled it out everywhere, you have even more feedback. With every rollout, you get more feedback. That means there's more opportunity to improve. And that's really what we want to harvest, right? We want to make sure you continue to evolve everything, right? And that's relevant for security, it's relevant for our development optimization and automation, and that's true for our operational automation. I want to highlight a little bit on the people side here as well, because I think that is important, right? So it is these kind of 4 enablements from a change management perspective, right? We need to actually have this at the grassroots with the developers. They need to understand this and they need to buy into it. Yeah, so that means they need to have understanding. We need to enable them with the skills, right? Developers might not necessarily know about this. If your organization always had a security guy doing the audits, then the developer might not be aware or sensitized to what does it actually mean to do secure coding. We need to support by leadership, right? And that's partly not just punishment, right? Not just saying, well, you can't have security vulnerabilities. You need to solve all at once. No. It's like, understand that this is an evolution. Understand that the threat profile keeps evolving and that the organization needs to evolve with that as well. Transparency around metrics and governance, I think, is really important for everyone so that we know what it is, right? You can only really fix what you can see, right? And then we need to have the right tooling and process, of course. And we understand that. On the right-hand side is a DevSecOps manifesto, which has a couple of these components, right? And I'll highlight only a few of them, right? So the obvious one, I feel, is 24/7 proactive security monitoring. So we want to actually find the problem before someone else. Right? We want to find that there's a denial of service attack happening before it actually causes us any grief. Yeah, we want to understand that there's someone starts sniffing out our ports before they actually find their way in. We want to start seeing when data loads change so that more information gets moved out of the organization than any other time. Because it shows us clearly, wait a second, there's something going wrong here. Like, is it the business process that has changed? Or has a bad actor been in our organization and is now starting to get stuff out, right? We want to make sure that all these teams work in an open contribution model, similar to open source, right? Because the engineering standards will continue to evolve and the goal phase. Right? The developers will continue to make improvements, and you want to then harvest that and make it available to everyone else in the organization. It shouldn't be from a central group, a central DevSecOps group rolled out, and they own the vista. They should collaborate with everyone to make sure that the best thinking always bubbles up and then gets distributed widely. Yeah? And then in the middle, we have here these consumable security services. I call that governance and compliance as code. Right? We want to make it really easy for people to get it right. And that means we want to code as much as that into the pipelines so people don't have to think about it. Right? We want to make sure that certain rules and policies are just applied without anyone having to explicitly buy into it. Yeah, and through that, we can make sure that we have, for example, the right logging and tracing available. So that if something happens, if we know there's a new vulnerability in the market, we very quickly can identify where do we use the software, what are the changes, what can we do to do the next version up and fix it very quickly and roll that out. And only through that can we really achieve that speed to react, because as soon as humans have to be involved, it does become slow and we have to worry about it a lot more. And I see people with lots of Excel sheets and CMDB extracts to then figure out which versions of which library sits where. And that's not the answer here. Another thing that I just want to bring to this, and that is related to the change management, is we will not make one big leap. This is a co-evolution of different things, right? There's a co-evolution of the systems. So that means our architecture, our applications. It's a co-evolution of the capabilities where engineers can do more automation themselves, etc., and the organization, which means the teaming structure. right? To just say, you're now an end-to-end DevSecOps team, go and be happy, or while your systems have dependencies across lots of other applications, while your security guys are still sitting in a different organizational structure, it's not going to work, right? So you need to evolve these three things again and again together. You can't just take one of these, evolve it all the way to the top and hope that everything else will follow. And this is really a co-evolution of these things. And then, and this is the last slide that I have, it is a DevOps model, it's a DevSecOps model. And that means this is how complex this stuff looks like, right? So we have new stuff coming in, we have things coming in from operations, and we have all these kind of security concerns that we have to worry about. And we need to bring them into an integrated framework so that the teams at the end, you see on the right-hand side, this DevOps team here, that's a team that end-to-end owns a function, sees user stories coming in, and they can be security user stories or functional user stories. And we get these operational and production feedback that we need to pull in. And they need to ultimately have this plan cycle on Scrum and a pull model on Kanban and navigate that as a lever that can be pulled up and down to really figure out if we have a higher threat profile, we're going to pull that dial further up towards the pull model on our security backlog, right? Or if it's there's more business stuff and we're pretty stable on that, we dial that back down. And if we don't understand this complex system and keep improving this system, then our implementation will fail. And unfortunately, I haven't seen any kind of methodology that has really fully picked this up, right? So all the organizations I work with are currently trying to figure out what are the correct parameters to drive this system and run this system. So hopefully I gave you a little bit of an insight of how this can look like in a complex environment. Hopefully it gives you some hope that there's a lot of good stuff out there, but also a little bit of thinking of the complexities that we have to deal with. And I'm sure that as I do, you will see that through this transformation, that there's a lot of amazing things coming to front, as amazing the developers do. And it's a lot more secure for all of us as customers, as consumers, as employees. And I think that's something that we can all get excited about and that should get us up in the morning to do this. So thank you for joining the event. Hopefully you're learning a lot from all these talks, and I wish you all the best on your DevSecOps journey.